Now, if you happen to be buying your first full-frame Sony prime lens, then you've probably come across these two options. The Sony 35mm f1.8 and the Sony 50mm f1.8. So if you're tearing your hair out and can't decide which one to go for, then stick with me because we're going to be going through everything there is to know about these two lenses and testing them head-to-head to find out which one is the best one for you. So featherweight would be a bit of an understatement when describing either of these two lenses, but this is especially true for the 50mm. To help put some context into just how lightweight this thing is, it weighs roughly the same as about 4 cinnamon Pop-Tarts, or around 2 adult hamsters, or even the same weight as around 15 human testicles, you know, like the ones I've got stored in my basement. Shit, did I actually just say that out loud? Okay, just play it cool, Tom. I don't think anyone's notified the police yet. So whilst I'm waiting for my inevitable incarceration, I might as well talk about the features on these two lenses. Starting with the 35mm, the metal lens body includes an MF to AF switch, a customizable AF lock button, as well as a dust and moisture resistant design to give it some protection from the elements. The 50mm on the other hand is, well, essentially a plastic tube with some glass inside it. Luckily though, this lack of features is reflected in the price. In fact, the 50mm is the cheapest Sony lens currently available, coming in around £159 or $248 on Amazon. Now, although the 35mm is still widely regarded as an affordable option, in comparison to the 50mm, it is considerably more expensive, priced at £530 or $748. So when it comes to scoring, obviously the 50mm is going to grab a very easy point for price. When it comes to build and handling, the 35mm is going to pick up both points from me, as it's far superior in terms of construction and also offers a better range of features. That said, I am willing to give the 50mm half a point for handling, mainly due to the fact that it is just so lightweight and small. When it comes to autofocus, in good lighting conditions, both lenses are quick and accurate to focus with no signs of hunting. In low light conditions, although both lenses did slow slightly, the 35mm was noticeably quicker to focus than the 50mm. The good news though is that neither lens displayed any signs of hunting even in these super low light conditions. When shooting a moving target at f1.8 in continuous burst mode, the overwhelming majority of the photos we captured were sharp and in focus, with just a handful that was slightly misfocused, mainly as George got closer to the camera. So with performances that are just too close to call an overall winner, both lenses gain a point apiece in this round. When shooting a moving target in video mode at f1.8, the 35mm managed to keep locked onto George as he walked towards the camera at a regular pace. The 50mm did an okay job too, but I did notice that the AF would slightly lag behind George as he got closer to the camera, almost as if it couldn't move fast enough to keep up with the pace. When repeating the test but at a faster pace, my theory was confirmed, as this time the 50mm really struggled to keep up with George as he walked towards the camera, whilst the 35mm had no issues at all. As for AF noise, the 35mm is completely silent, whilst the 50mm made some purring and clicking noises that did happen to be picked up by our camera's built-in microphone. When focusing manually with these lenses, both offer a smooth rotation with a nice amount of resistance and responsive control, which is ideal for focus pulls. When it comes to focus breathing, the 50mm is the worst offender here, which might be yet another turn-off for videographers, whilst the 35mm on the other hand has very little focus breathing to worry about. So at the end of this round of testing, it's pretty clear that for videographers, the 35mm is the better option to go for, and so it picks up a point in this round. In our Bokeh balls test, both lenses produced nice round orbs at the centre that turn into cat-sized shapes towards the edges of the frame. However, I should point out that the orbs on the 50mm are noticeably more jagged at the centre due to it only having 7 aperture blades, whilst in comparison the 35mm has a total of 9 aperture blades and therefore creates more rounded orbs. When we zoom into these images, you can see that the bokeh created by the 50mm is far softer than the 35mm, which appears much more textured and messy in comparison. So when scoring for bokeh, things do get a little bit more complicated here, because technically the 35mm offers the best bokeh balls. However, the 50mm clearly offers superior bokeh quality. However, when it comes to scoring for points, I am going to be fairly generous here and give the edge to the 50mm because for me, the difference between these two images when it comes to general bokeh quality is just night and day. The 50mm is far superior in my opinion. And I would argue that for portrait photography in particular, general bokeh quality is far more important than the shape of the bokeh balls, as bokeh is present in all of your shots, whilst bokeh balls are largely situational. On our lens flare test, the 50mm is the clear winner here, as it's able to deal with ghosting and artifacting better than the more expensive 35mm. Though I should mention that both of these lenses do come included with lens hoods in the box to help you shade the front element in harsh lighting conditions. On our longitudinal chromatic aberration test, both lenses showed signs of green fringing at the top of the image and red fringing below the area of sharp focus. When it comes to shooting with these lenses out in the real world, honestly, both of them are brilliant options to consider. Both of them are so small and lightweight that it honestly makes it so easy just to chuck them into your camera bag and just carry them around with you all of the time, just in case you need them. Obviously, the thing we haven't spoken about yet, and probably one of the biggest differences between these two lenses, is their focal length. So, how much difference is there between a 35mm and a 50mm lens? Well, quite a noticeable difference, as you can see from these two shots here, which I took from the exact same location. Obviously, the 35mm is a much wider focal length, and you'll be able to capture more of the surrounding environment within your image. Now, in order to achieve the same kind of composition with the 50mm, you'd need to step back quite a way, which isn't always possible, and especially for me when I was shooting in this small apartment. However, the benefit of the 50mm is that you are more zoomed in, so you are able to isolate your subject a lot more easily than you can with a 35mm lens, even when shooting wide open at f1.8. Also, this longer focal length of 50mm means that you get less distortion than you would with a 35mm, which means that you'll achieve slightly more attractive results when shooting portraits, especially if you like to shoot close up. Now, if you want to find out more about the differences between these two specific focal lengths, then I suggest you check out this video here that I made by opening it into a new tab and watching it after this one. Don't click away! Stop it! Watch it afterwards. Thank you. Ultimately though, it is important to remember that neither one focal length is better or worse than the other. They both have their own list of pros and cons, and which one you'll end up buying will largely depend on what you intend to do with it and your own personal preference in terms of aesthetics. One criteria we can judge on though is sharpness, though the only problem is that from a distance it is really hard to tell which of these lenses produces the sharpest results. However, when we take a look at the lens chart results, it becomes clearer that the 35mm produces the sharpest results with a higher amount of contrast when shooting wide open at f1.8. At the corners, although the 35mm results are now slightly softer, in comparison to the 50mm, it is still the sharpest option. If you'd like to shoot close up, then the 35mm is actually your best option here, as it has a much shorter minimum focusing distance than the 50mm. Though in terms of sharpness when shooting at this distance, both lenses produce equally sharp results at f1.8. So despite the 50mm providing a strong performance in this round, the 35mm for me has to gain the final point here, due to it being able to produce sharper images with more contrast. However, I am going to award yet another half point to the 50mm here because, sharpness aside, this lens doesn't really fall all that far behind the 50mm when it comes to overall image quality. This means that in our head-to-head battle, the Sony 35mm f1.8 is the winner due to it being able to capture crisper images, as well as having a superior AF system with a better array of features. However, if after seeing the images I've taken in this test, you now decided that the 50mm focal length is the one for you, then honestly, this budget option from Sony is kind of a no-brainer. For 150 quid, it's a pretty decent choice, so long as you don't use it for video, and it's one that I'd happily recommend to anyone shopping on a super tight budget.